It's lovely to have you here. Before we get into tonight's subject, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Maybe you're already in bed with the room mostly dark, maybe you're stretched out on the sofa after a long day, or perhaps you're listening from somewhere much farther away while everything around you slowly winds down. Wherever you are, I hope you're comfortable, settled, and ready to let your mind wander for a while. If you enjoy these calm, late-night journeys through science, a like and subscribe really does help the channel. And if you've been watching for a while already, thank you. Your support keeps the Sleepy Scientist growing, and I'm genuinely grateful that you keep coming back. A couple of quiet mentions before we begin. We have an ebook available on the Sleepy Scientist website. You'll see a QR code on screen for the next few minutes, and there's a link in the description whenever you'd like to find it. And we're now uploading episodes to Spotify, so if you'd rather listen with your screen off and your eyes closed, you can find us there too. Tonight's topic is a strange one, because consciousness is something you know more directly than almost anything else. You know what it feels like to see colour, hear music, remember a face, feel tired, or simply sit quietly and think. And yet, for all of neuroscience's progress, nobody can fully explain why any of that inner experience exists. Scientists can track brain activity as consciousness fades under anesthesia. They can study split brain patients whose two hemispheres no longer communicate normally. They can watch decisions begin forming before someone becomes aware of choosing. And they can build theories about how information is shared, integrated, and made available across the brain. But the deepest question is still sitting there. Why does any of it feel like something from the inside? That is where things become difficult. So get comfortable, let your thoughts slow down, and we'll gently make our way through one of the biggest unanswered questions in all of science. What is consciousness? And why can scientists still not explain it? Consciousness is one of those things that seems perfectly ordinary until you try to explain it. Right now, wherever you happen to be, there is something it feels like to be there. Perhaps the room is dim. Perhaps you can hear a faint sound in the background. Maybe your eyes are beginning to feel heavy, or you're aware of the weight of your head against a pillow. None of these experiences are simply pieces of information. They have a quality to them. Colour looks like something. Music sounds like something. Pain hurts. Warmth feels warm. Even a passing thought arrives with a strange sense of belonging to you. This private inner world is consciousness in its most familiar form. And yet familiarity does not make it easy to understand. A person can be awake without being fully aware of everything around them. They can respond to a stimulus without consciously noticing it. The brain can perform complicated calculations, regulate breathing, control posture, interpret parts of the visual world, and prepare movements without those processes appearing in conscious experience at all. So being awake is not quite the same as being conscious. Responding is not necessarily the same as experiencing. Intelligence is not automatically the same as awareness. Attention, perception, memory, and self-knowledge all overlap with consciousness, but none of them provides a perfect definition of it. That creates an immediate problem for scientists. Normally, science works by taking something difficult to understand and defining it in terms that can be measured. Temperature can be connected to physical processes involving energy and particle motion. Electrical activity can be measured as changes in voltage. Blood flow can be tracked. Behavior can be recorded. Consciousness is different because the thing being studied has two sides. From the outside, a brain is a physical object. It contains roughly 86 billion neurons, supported by enormous networks of other cells. Those neurons communicate through electrical impulses and chemical signals. Researchers can record some of that activity using electrodes. They can measure changes in blood oxygenation with brain imaging. They can examine which regions communicate with one another, observe the effects of injuries, measure neurotransmitters, and watch behavior change as different parts of the nervous system are disturbed. From the inside, however, none of that is what consciousness feels like. You do not experience electrical impulses travelling along an axon. You experience the colour blue. You do not feel oxygenated blood moving through visual cortex. You see a face. You do not normally notice neurotransmitter molecules binding to receptors. You feel calm, anxious, curious, tired, amused, or perhaps slightly annoyed that a brain containing billions of cells still refuses to explain itself properly. That gap between the outside description and the inside experience sits at the center of consciousness research. Scientists sometimes describe this as a difference between the third-person perspective and the first-person perspective. The third-person perspective is publicly observable. A researcher can measure a brain signal, repeat the experiment, compare participants, and allow another laboratory to test the same result. The first-person perspective is private. If you say that you are experiencing a deep red colour, another person can believe you. They can measure what your brain is doing while you report it. They might even predict when you will say that you saw the colour. But they cannot directly enter your experience and inspect the redness itself. This strange divide becomes even more noticeable because consciousness can disappear. Every night, the ordinary waking world fades as we fall asleep. Sometimes experience continues in dreams. At other times, long periods seem to pass without any remembered experience at all. A person can lose consciousness after fainting. Certain seizures can interrupt awareness. General anesthetic drugs can remove ordinary experience for the duration of an operation. Severe brain injuries can leave someone awake in the sense that their eyes open and close while giving very little outward evidence of awareness. Then, under the right circumstances, consciousness returns. The room comes back. Sounds acquire meaning again. Thoughts begin appearing. The private world restarts. This makes consciousness more than an abstract philosophical curiosity. Doctors need to know whether a patient who cannot move or speak might still be aware. Anesthetists need reliable ways of judging whether consciousness has been sufficiently suppressed during surgery. Researchers studying infants face the problem of investigating experience before language is available. Scientists studying animals must decide what kinds of nervous systems are capable of pain, pleasure, fear, or other conscious states. And increasingly, another question has joined the list. If an artificial system becomes extraordinarily good at conversation, reasoning, memory, or problem-solving, would any of that mean there is actually something it feels like to be that system? At present, science has no universally accepted test that can settle that question. This is what makes consciousness such an unusual scientific mystery. Progress has been enormous. Researchers know far more about which brain systems are associated with wakefulness, perception, attention, memory, and report than they did only a few decades ago. They can sometimes detect signs of hidden awareness in patients who appear unresponsive. They can observe large changes in brain communication as consciousness fades under anesthesia. They can study what happens when information reaches awareness and compare it with remarkably similar information that remains unconscious. But knowing when consciousness is present is not the same as explaining why it exists. A sufficiently complete map of brain activity might eventually tell us which neurons are active whenever someone sees red, hears a melody, feels pain, or remembers a childhood afternoon. The deeper question would still remain. Why should those physical events produce an experience at all? Why should electrical activity, chemical signaling, and organized biological tissue create a private point of view? Scientists are becoming increasingly skilled at studying the conditions surrounding consciousness. What they still cannot agree on is why there is something happening on the inside. Long before anyone could place a person inside a brain scanner or record the electrical activity of a single neuron, people were already wondering what sort of thing a mind could possibly be. For much of history, the question belonged mainly to philosophy. There was no modern neuroscience, no detailed map of the brain, and no way to watch neural activity while someone remembered a face or noticed a colour. What people did have was the strange certainty of their own experience. Thoughts seemed private. Sensations appeared from nowhere visible. The body was clearly physical. but the mind did not feel much like a physical object. René Descartes gave one of the most influential answers in the 17th century. Descartes argued for substance dualism, the idea that mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of substance. The body belongs to the physical world. It has extension, occupies space, and obeys physical laws. The mind, in his account, is something different. It thinks, experiences, and possesses consciousness without simply being another piece of matter. This solved one problem rather neatly by declaring the mind fundamentally different from the body. Unfortunately, it created another rather large problem. If mind and matter are genuinely separate, how does one influence the other? A decision to raise your hand appears to cause a physical arm to move. A physical injury can produce conscious pain. Alcohol, anesthetic drugs, sleep deprivation, brain damage, and countless other physical changes can alter thought and experience. Whatever consciousness is, it seems remarkably difficult to separate from what the brain is doing. By the 19th century, the relationship between consciousness and biology had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Thomas Henry Huxley considered whether conscious experience might accompany nervous activity without actually controlling it. He compared consciousness to something like a secondary effect of the machinery beneath it, an idea that became associated with epiphenomenalism. On this view, physical brain processes could produce consciousness, while consciousness itself might contribute little or nothing to physical behavior. It is an uncomfortable possibility. Your thoughts could feel as though they are guiding your actions, while the real causal work is being performed elsewhere in the nervous system. William James approached consciousness from another direction. Writing during the development of scientific psychology, James famously described consciousness as a stream. Experience does not normally arrive as a collection of isolated mental photographs. It flows. One thought blends into another. Attention shifts. Memories appear and disappear. Sensations are constantly organized into a changing but apparently continuous point of view. That flowing character remains immediately recognizable. Yet describing what consciousness is like still does not explain how it arises. During the 20th century, psychology and neuroscience increasingly replaced purely philosophical speculation with experiments. Researchers began measuring perception, memory, reaction times, attention, learning, brain injuries, electrical activity, and eventually the activity of large networks throughout the living brain. This produced extraordinary progress. Scientists could ask how the brain distinguishes one object from another. They could investigate how information enters memory, why attention selects some signals and ignores others, how people produce verbal reports, and how sensory information influences behavior. These are difficult problems, but they are difficult in a familiar scientific way. In the 1990s, philosopher David Chalmers drew a distinction that would become central to modern debates about consciousness. He described many questions about cognition as the easy problems of consciousness. The name can be misleading. There is nothing particularly easy about explaining attention, perception, memory, decision-making, language, or behavioral control. Each can occupy an entire scientific career without showing the slightest sign of becoming simple. They are called easy because, at least in principle, we know what a successful explanation would look like. If we want to explain how the brain recognizes a face, we can study incoming visual information, neural processing, stored representations, and the behavior that follows. If we want to understand working memory, we can investigate how information is maintained and manipulated over short periods. If we want to explain attention, we can study how some information is selected while competing information is suppressed. The hard problem is different. It asks why any of these physical and computational processes should be accompanied by subjective experience. Why does seeing red actually look like red? Why does sugar taste sweet? Why does a violin have a particular sound rather than merely causing the nervous system to classify vibrations? Why does embarrassment have an unpleasant inner texture? And why does bodily damage hurt instead of simply triggering withdrawal behavior without any feeling attached? This felt aspect of experience is often called phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness refers to what an experience is like from the inside. It includes colour, sound, taste, pain, emotion, bodily sensation, imagery, and the countless other qualities that populate our inner lives. Philosopher Ned Block distinguished this from access consciousness. Information is access conscious when it is available for reasoning, deliberate decision-making, memory, verbal report, and the flexible control of behaviour. Something enters the mental workspace, so to speak, and can then be used by several other systems. The difficult question is whether phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness are actually the same thing. Perhaps an experience becomes conscious precisely when information becomes globally available for thought and action. Or perhaps the experience itself can exist before or even without that wider access. Experiments attempting to separate these possibilities have become an important part of consciousness research. Behind the disagreement lies what philosophers often call the explanatory gap. Imagine, for a moment, that neuroscience became unbelievably precise. Suppose researchers could describe every relevant event occurring while a person looked at a red apple. They knew which photoreceptors responded to the light, which signals travelled through the optic nerve, how the thalamus processed them, which areas of visual cortex became active, how information moved through larger neural networks, which memories were retrieved, and exactly why the person eventually said, "I see red." That would be an astonishing scientific explanation. And someone could still ask one more question. Why did all of that processing produce the experience of redness? This is the gap the hard problem is intended to expose. David Chalmers illustrated the difficulty using the philosophical idea of a zombie. This does not mean the shuffling variety that tends to appear in films at inconvenient moments. A philosophical zombie is imagined as a being physically and behaviourally identical to a conscious human, but possessing no inner experience at all. It would say that strawberries are red. It would withdraw its hand from a flame. It might insist that it was conscious. But, by definition, nothing would actually be experienced inside. The thought experiment is not evidence that such creatures exist, or that they are physically possible. Its purpose is to ask whether a complete description of behaviour and physical processing automatically explains subjective experience. And that distinction matters because several separate questions are often compressed into the single word consciousness. What does consciousness allow an organism to do? Which animals or systems possess it? How can we detect it when someone cannot communicate? Which parts of the brain are necessary for it? How does information become consciously accessible, and why should those physical mechanisms produce an inner life at all? These questions may eventually turn out to have one connected answer. For now, they do not. The hard problem remains partly philosophical, because it asks what would count as an explanation of experience in the first place. But it also drives experimental science, because before anyone can hope to explain why consciousness exists, researchers first have to discover exactly what changes in the brain when consciousness appears, disappears, or changes its contents. That search has transformed an ancient mystery into something scientists can begin to measure, even if the deepest part of the mystery is still waiting. If consciousness depends on the brain, then the next question is what sort of machinery the brain actually is. At first glance, the answer sounds almost disappointingly physical. The adult human brain weighs roughly 1.3 to 1.4 kilograms. It is soft tissue made of cells, blood vessels, water, fats, proteins, and dissolved chemicals. There is nothing inside it that obviously looks like a thought, a memory, a colour, or a feeling. And yet this is the organ from which all of those things seem to emerge. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Alongside them are glial cells, present in a broadly comparable order of magnitude, performing essential roles in support, insulation, metabolism, immune defense, and the regulation of the environment in which neurons operate. Neither group works alone. A neuron is not a tiny conscious agent sitting inside the skull making decisions. It is a living cell specialized for receiving, processing, and transmitting signals. Most neurons possess branching structures called dendrites, a cell body, and a long projection called an axon. When the electrical conditions across the neuron's membrane reach a critical threshold, the cell can generate an action potential. An action potential is a rapid electrical change that travels along the axon. When it reaches the end of the neuron, it can trigger the release of chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. These molecules cross tiny gaps called synapses and bind to receptors on neighboring cells. Some signals make another neuron more likely to fire. This is known as excitation. Others make firing less likely. This is inhibition. The balance between excitation and inhibition helps control when neural activity begins, how strongly it spreads, and when it stops. But the important point is that no single action potential appears to contain a conscious experience. A neuron fires, another neuron responds, a population becomes active, and patterns of activity move through networks containing thousands, millions, or sometimes much larger numbers of cells. Somewhere within the organization of those patterns, consciousness appears to depend on what the brain is doing. Finding exactly where that dependency lies has turned out to be difficult. Different parts of the nervous system contribute different pieces. Deep in the brain, structures within the brainstem help regulate arousal and wakefulness. Networks associated with the reticular activating system influence whether the cerebral cortex is in a state capable of supporting ordinary waking awareness. Severe disruption of these systems can produce profound reductions in consciousness. Higher up sits the thalamus, a collection of nuclei positioned near the center of the brain. The thalamus is sometimes casually described as a sensory relay station, but that description is much too simple. It participates in extensive communication with the cerebral cortex and helps regulate the flow and coordination of information across large parts of the brain. Above and around these deeper structures lies the cerebral cortex. The cortex supports an enormous range of functions, including vision, hearing, touch, language, memory, planning, voluntary action, and complex forms of perception. These regions are highly specialized, but they are also heavily interconnected. Visual information, for example, does not simply travel in one direction from the eyes to a final location where seeing somehow happens. Signals move forward through sensory pathways, but there is also extensive recurrent feedback. Higher regions send information back toward earlier sensory areas. Cortical regions interact repeatedly with the thalamus. Specialized networks exchange information with one another over both short and long distances. The brain is therefore less like a simple chain of switches and more like an enormous system of conversations occurring at the same time. Some of those conversations appear to be especially important for consciousness. Researchers often distinguish between the level of consciousness and the contents of consciousness. The level refers broadly to whether conscious experience is present and how available or responsive the system is. Someone who is fully awake has a high level of ordinary consciousness. Deep general anesthesia can reduce it dramatically. Severe brain injury can place a person somewhere between these extremes. The contents of consciousness are different. They are whatever fills experience at a particular moment. A face. A sound. An itch on your arm. A memory. The feeling of being tired. You might remain at roughly the same overall level of consciousness while the contents change continuously from one second to another. This distinction matters because the systems maintaining wakefulness are not necessarily the same systems representing a particular colour, face, sound, or thought. The brain also remains extraordinarily active even when nothing obvious is happening. Although it accounts for only a small percentage of total body mass, the adult brain typically consumes around 1/5 of the body's resting energy. Much of that energy supports the continuous electrical and chemical work required to maintain neural signaling, membrane potentials, synaptic activity, and the brain's ongoing internal organization. So the brain is not a quiet machine waiting for something interesting to happen. It is already busy. Even at rest, large networks display organized patterns of activity. Perception enters a system that is continuously maintaining internal states, memories, expectations, bodily regulation, and communication across distant regions. This helps explain why researchers have struggled to locate one single consciousness center. If consciousness lived in one tiny patch of tissue, the problem might be rather easier. Instead, lesion studies show that different kinds of damage can remove specific abilities or particular forms of experience, while leaving much else intact. Damage to visual systems may disrupt conscious vision without eliminating consciousness itself. Damage involving language systems can severely affect speech while leaving experience present. Injury to brainstem or thalamic systems can alter the overall level of consciousness far more dramatically. Association regions of the cortex appear important for bringing together complex information, while communication among distributed networks may be just as important as the activity of individual regions. Electrical stimulation provides another clue. Stimulating certain areas can produce flashes of light, bodily sensations, memories, urges to move, changes in emotion, or alterations in perception. But researchers have not discovered one simple switch that turns the complete phenomenon of consciousness on and off, while leaving everything else untouched. The emerging picture is therefore distributed. Arousal systems help maintain the conditions in which consciousness can occur. Sensory regions contribute specific contents. The thalamus and cortex exchange information through recurrent loops. Association areas help organize complex representations. Large-scale networks allow distant regions to influence one another. And somewhere within this layered biological activity, the difference between unconscious processing and conscious experience appears. That still leaves an important problem. Knowing all of the parts involved is not enough. A radio can be taken apart into circuits, wires, and components, but listing those pieces does not by itself explain the pattern of information traveling through the device. Consciousness presents an even harder version of that problem. Researchers do not merely want to know which brain regions are active during experience. They want to identify the smallest set of neural mechanisms that reliably distinguishes conscious processing from activity that remains entirely outside awareness. In other words, once the machinery has been mapped, the search becomes more precise. Which parts of this enormous living network are actually necessary for a conscious experience to occur? Once scientists accepted that consciousness could be studied through the brain, a more practical question emerged. What exactly should they look for? One of the most influential attempts to answer this came from Francis Crick and Christoph Koch. Their approach was deliberately modest, rather than beginning by trying to solve the entire philosophical mystery of consciousness in one enormous leap. They focused on something biology might actually be able to measure. They searched for the neural correlates of consciousness. A neural correlate of consciousness is usually described as the minimum set of neural mechanisms that is jointly sufficient for a particular conscious experience. That definition sounds simple, but it immediately raises some difficult distinctions. Imagine that someone consciously sees a red circle. Before that experience can occur, the person must already be awake enough for the brain to support conscious perception. Their eyes must receive light. Visual signals must travel through the nervous system. Later, they might press a button to report that they saw the circle. But not every one of those events is necessarily part of the conscious experience itself. Wakefulness may be a prerequisite. Pressing the button may be a consequence. The real challenge is finding the neural activity that most directly corresponds to the actual experience of seeing the red circle. This is why researchers often design experiments in which the physical stimulus remains nearly identical while conscious perception changes. A faint image might be detected on some trials and missed on others. Two competing images can be presented in a way that causes conscious perception to alternate between them, even though the stimulation reaching the eyes changes very little. A picture can be displayed briefly and then hidden by another visual pattern, producing conscious perception on some occasions but not others. If the sensory input is closely matched, differences in brain activity become more informative. Researchers can then ask which neural events track awareness itself. Several technologies are used to approach the problem from different angles. Electroencephalography measures tiny voltage changes at the scalp produced by the coordinated electrical activity of large populations of neurons. It can detect changes over milliseconds, making it especially useful for studying when different stages of processing occur. Magnetoencephalography measures the magnetic fields generated by neural activity and also provides very fine timing information. Functional magnetic resonance imaging works differently. It tracks changes associated with blood oxygenation, allowing researchers to estimate which regions of the brain become more active during particular tasks. For some medical patients, electrodes can be placed directly inside the brain for clinical reasons. Intracranial recordings from these electrodes can provide extremely detailed information about neural activity that would otherwise be impossible to obtain in humans. Scientists can also study what happens when particular regions are damaged. Lesion studies have been invaluable because losing a function after damage can reveal whether a region is necessary for that ability. Other methods go beyond observation. Direct electrical stimulation can briefly alter the activity of specific areas of the brain, sometimes producing sensations, movements, memories, or unusual perceptual experiences. Transcranial magnetic stimulation uses rapidly changing magnetic fields outside the skull to influence cortical activity for short periods, giving researchers another way to test whether particular brain processes contribute causally to perception and awareness. Even with all these tools, however, there is a surprisingly awkward problem. The participant usually has to tell the scientist whether something was consciously experienced. And reporting an experience requires more than consciousness. A person may need to notice the stimulus, hold it in memory, make a decision, prepare speech or movement, and then produce a response. All of those operations create additional brain activity. So if a scanner shows strong activation in a particular area when someone says they saw an image, that activity might represent the experience itself. Or it might reflect attention. It might reflect working memory. It could be decision-making. It might even be the preparation required to press a button. A beautiful coloured brain scan can therefore be very persuasive to look at, while still leaving the most important question unresolved. This difficulty motivated Natsuko Tsuchiya and other researchers to develop what are known as no-report paradigms. Instead of repeatedly asking people to announce what they are experiencing, researchers try to infer changes in conscious perception from signals that require less deliberate reporting. Eye movements can sometimes reveal what a person is seeing. The pupils can change depending on the contents of perception. Certain reflexive responses or involuntary patterns of behavior can also provide clues. Removing explicit reports does not remove every possible confounding factor, but it reduces the amount of extraneural activity created simply by asking someone to describe their experience. This has fed into one of the major debates in consciousness research. Some evidence suggests that posterior regions of the cerebral cortex, particularly sensory and association areas toward the back of the brain, may play a central role in generating the contents of conscious experience. Other studies indicate important involvement of the prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain. The disagreement is not simply about geography. If frontal activity mainly appears when a person must report, remember, or act on an experience, then it may be more closely connected with conscious access than with experience itself. If frontal activity remains important even when those requirements are reduced, then its role may be more fundamental. Researchers therefore distinguish among several related ideas. Neural prerequisites create the conditions necessary for consciousness. Content-specific neural correlates are associated with particular experiences, such as seeing a face, rather than hearing a sound. A full neural correlate would refer more broadly to the mechanisms sufficient for conscious experience. Neural consequences are processes that happen because an experience has occurred, such as storing it in memory or reporting it aloud. Separating these layers is extremely difficult because the brain performs them in rapid succession and often at the same time. And even if scientists eventually identify a perfectly reliable neural signature of consciousness, one problem remains untouched. Suppose a specific pattern of brain activity always appeared whenever someone consciously saw red. Suppose it appeared in every person every time, without a single exception. That would be a remarkable discovery. It would tell us when conscious redness was present, and perhaps which mechanisms were necessary to support it. But correlation alone would still not explain why that pattern of activity feels red from the inside. The neural correlates of consciousness may therefore provide one of the clearest maps science can build toward conscious experience. What they do not automatically provide is the final explanation of why experience exists at all. One of the strangest lessons from consciousness research is that the brain can do far more without awareness than we usually imagine. We tend to assume that if the brain detects something, understands it, or uses it to guide behavior, then we must somehow be conscious of it. But that is not always true. The nervous system can process information, prepare movements, influence emotion, and even make surprisingly accurate distinctions without producing a clear, reportable experience. One of the most dramatic examples is blindsight. Blindsight was studied extensively by Lawrence Weisskranz and colleagues in people with damage to the primary visual cortex, a region at the back of the brain that is normally essential for conscious vision. Some patients reported being completely blind in part of their visual field. If an object appeared there, they insisted that they could not see it. Yet when researchers asked them to guess where the object was located, which direction it moved, or sometimes what basic properties it had, their answers could be significantly better than chance. The patients were not pretending to be blind. They genuinely reported no visual experience. But some visual information was still being processed through alternative pathways in the brain. Blindsight therefore reveals an important distinction. Visual information can affect behavior without necessarily becoming part of conscious sight. A similar lesson appears in visual masking experiments. A picture or word can be flashed very briefly, and then followed almost immediately by another image that interferes with conscious perception of the first. A participant may report seeing nothing meaningful, and yet the hidden stimulus can sometimes influence reaction times, later choices, or measurable brain activity. The effect is usually limited and highly dependent on the experimental conditions, but it shows that information can begin influencing the nervous system before it reaches awareness. Another elegant example is binocular rivalry. In the 19th century, Charles Wheatstone helped establish the phenomenon by presenting different images separately to each eye. Instead of consciously seeing both images perfectly combined, perception often alternates. One image dominates awareness for a while, then the other takes over, then perhaps it switches back again. The physical stimulation reaching the eyes remains relatively stable, yet conscious experience changes. This gives researchers a useful way to separate sensory input from what actually enters awareness. Attention creates another complication. Daniel Simons and Christopher Shabry demonstrated this vividly through experiments on inattentional blindness. When participants were asked to focus carefully on one task, such as counting passes between people, they could completely miss an unexpected and highly visible event occurring directly in front of them. The famous demonstration involved a person in a gorilla costume walking through the scene. Once you know the gorilla is there, it seems almost impossible to miss. But many people do. Their eyes receive the information, the visual system processes the scene, yet the unexpected object never seems to become part of conscious awareness. This does not mean that attention and consciousness are completely separate. They are closely connected. Attention helps select information for deeper processing, and attended information is often more likely to become conscious. But experiments suggest that attention and consciousness are not simply two names for exactly the same process. There are also subtler examples involving subliminal priming. A stimulus presented too briefly or weakly to be consciously reported may slightly influence how quickly a person responds to something that appears moments later. If the hidden word is related to the next word, for example, recognition can sometimes become a little faster. These effects are real under controlled conditions, but they are generally modest. They should not be confused with the much more dramatic popular claims that hidden messages can secretly control complicated decisions, completely alter personalities, or make people purchase products against their will. The unconscious brain is impressive enough without giving it magical advertising powers. Taken together, these experiments reveal something important. Consciousness is not required for every form of information processing. The brain can detect patterns without awareness. It can prepare movements without awareness. It can respond emotionally to information without full awareness. It can guide behavior using signals that never become part of a clear conscious experience. This makes the search for consciousness more difficult. If complex processing can happen unconsciously, then simply finding neural activity, intelligent behavior, or accurate discrimination cannot tell us where consciousness begins. Something additional appears to happen when information moves from being processed somewhere in the nervous system to becoming something that is actually experienced. And perhaps the clearest demonstration of just how strangely the brain can divide its own information comes from patients in whom the two cerebral hemispheres have been deliberately separated. In those unusual cases, the question is no longer only what the brain can do without awareness. It becomes whether one brain can contain more than one partly independent stream of awareness at the same time. The two halves of the human brain are not simply mirror images working independently. They are connected by enormous bundles of nerve fibers that allow information to pass back and forth continuously. The largest of these pathways is the corpus callosum. It contains hundreds of millions of nerve fibers linking corresponding and specialized regions across the left and right cerebral hemispheres. Under ordinary conditions, this communication is so constant that the two sides behave as parts of a single coordinated system. But in a small number of patients with severe epilepsy, doctors deliberately disrupted that connection. The procedure is known as corpus callosotomy. It was developed as a treatment for people whose seizures were so severe that they spread rapidly from one hemisphere to the other and could not be adequately controlled by medication. By cutting some or all of the corpus callosum, surgeons could reduce the ability of seizure activity to propagate across the brain. Neurosurgeons Joseph Bogan and Philip Vogel carried out important operations of this kind, and the patients later became central to some of the most famous experiments in the history of neuroscience. Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga studied what happened when the two hemispheres could no longer communicate normally. The results were deeply strange. To understand why, it helps to know that the brain processes visual information in a crossed arrangement. Information from the left side of the visual world is processed primarily by the right hemisphere. Information from the right side of the visual world is processed primarily by the left hemisphere. Control of the body is also largely crossed, so the left hemisphere controls much of the right side of the body, while the right hemisphere controls much of the left. This creates an unusual opportunity in a split-brain patient. Researchers could briefly show an image only in the left visual field. That information would travel mainly to the right hemisphere. In many people, language production is strongly dominated by the left hemisphere. So the right hemisphere might receive the image while the left hemisphere, which normally provides the spoken answer, remained unaware of what had been shown. When the person was asked what they had seen, they might say nothing. But if asked to use the left hand to select the matching object from several choices, the correct object could be chosen. The hand seemed to know something that the speaking hemisphere did not. This revealed a remarkable separation between perception, action, and verbal report. Similar experiments showed that one hemisphere could sometimes guide behavior using information that the other hemisphere could not access directly. The findings raised an obvious and rather unsettling question. Were there now two conscious minds inside one skull? The idea became one of the most famous interpretations of split-brain research. But the reality is more complicated. Patients do not usually behave in everyday life as if two completely independent people are fighting for control of one body. Many actions remain coordinated. The hemispheres can still receive overlapping information from the environment. not every neural connection between them is removed, and communication can sometimes continue through subcortical pathways and other surviving structures. The extent of disconnection also varies from patient to patient. Modern research has therefore made scientists more cautious about describing split-brain patients as simply containing two separate conscious agents. What the experiments clearly show is that some information can become available to one hemisphere without becoming available to the other. They also demonstrate that speech is not a perfect measure of awareness. If the language-dominant hemisphere cannot describe a stimulus, that does not necessarily mean the entire brain failed to process or perhaps experience it. Michael Gazzaniga later proposed another fascinating idea known as the interpreter hypothesis. According to this account, the left hemisphere has a strong tendency to create coherent explanations for behavior, even when it does not possess all the information that produced that behavior. In one type of experiment, the two hemispheres can receive different instructions. The person may then perform an action for a reason known only to the right hemisphere. If the speaking left hemisphere is asked why the action occurred, it may invent a perfectly reasonable explanation. The explanation feels convincing. It may simply not be true. This suggests that the conscious sense of being a single, unified self may partly depend on the brain continuously constructing a coherent story from information distributed across many systems. Split brain cases therefore challenge the intuitive idea that consciousness must exist as one indivisible thing. Perhaps unity depends on communication. Perhaps consciousness requires integration between specialized systems. Perhaps different streams of processing can support partly independent forms of awareness. Or perhaps the hemispheres remain more unified than the dramatic laboratory demonstrations first suggested. What these patients reveal with unusual clarity is that perception, memory, language, action, and conscious report can come apart. The mind that normally feels completely seamless may rely on constant coordination occurring quietly beneath awareness. And the corpus callosum provides one way of disrupting that coordination physically. There is another way to interfere with consciousness that is both more common and, in some respects, even stranger. Instead of cutting the connections between the two hemispheres, doctors can administer a small amount of chemistry and make ordinary conscious experience disappear almost completely. General anesthesia gives scientists an unusual opportunity to study consciousness by temporarily removing it. In medicine, anesthesia is not one single condition. It is a carefully controlled state involving several different effects, including loss of conscious awareness, loss of memory, reduced movement, and reduced responses to painful stimulation. Different drugs contribute to these effects in different ways. This matters because an anesthetized brain is not simply switched off. The brain remains active. Neurons continue firing. Blood still circulates. Many reflexes continue. Some sensory information can still enter the nervous system. The heart keeps beating. Breathing may continue with support. And large parts of the brain remain metabolically active. Anesthesia is therefore quite different from complete brain inactivity. It is also different from ordinary sleep. During sleep, the brain moves through naturally recurring states, including periods associated with vivid dreaming. A sleeping person can often be awakened by sufficiently strong stimulation. General anesthesia is produced chemically and can suppress responsiveness far more deeply. It also differs from coma, which usually results from injury, illness, or disruption of brain function, and may persist unpredictably. Anesthesia, by contrast, is designed to be reversible. The extraordinary thing is that several chemically different drugs can all disrupt ordinary conscious experience. Propofol is widely used to induce and maintain general anesthesia. It strongly enhances signaling involving gamma-aminobutyric acid, one of the brain's major inhibitory neurotransmitters. By increasing inhibitory activity, propofol changes the way large populations of neurons communicate and coordinate. The volatile anesthetics sevoflurane and isoflurane also influence gamma-aminobutyric acid receptors. But their actions are broader and include effects on several types of ion channels and other molecular targets. Xenon and nitrous oxide work differently again. Both can interfere with receptors activated by glutamate, particularly receptors involved in excitatory neural communication. Ketamine is especially interesting. Ketamine blocks a type of glutamate receptor and can produce profound changes in awareness while leaving some forms of internal experience surprisingly rich. A person may become unresponsive to the outside world while experiencing vivid imagery, dreamlike scenes, distorted bodily sensations, or a feeling of separation from the body. This makes ketamine scientifically useful because it demonstrates something important. Unresponsiveness is not the same thing as unconsciousness. Researchers such as Emery Brown, George Mashur, and Nicholas Franks have used anesthesia not only as a medical necessity, but also as a tool for studying how consciousness depends on brain organization. One major finding is that loss of consciousness often involves disruption in communication between distant brain regions. Under ordinary waking conditions, activity can move through large networks linking sensory regions, association areas, frontal and parietal cortex, the thalamus, and deeper arousal systems. Under many anesthetic drugs, this communication becomes less flexible and less integrated. Some signals remain strong locally, but fail to spread efficiently across the wider brain. Different regions may continue operating, but they communicate in a more fragmented way. This is particularly important in the relationship between the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. The thalamus is deeply involved in coordinating and regulating information flow across cortical systems. Anesthetic drugs can alter thalamocortical signaling, weakening some of the recurrent interactions that normally help maintain complex waking activity. Brainstem arousal systems are also affected. These deeper networks help regulate whether the cortex is in a state capable of supporting ordinary consciousness. Anesthesia can therefore disrupt consciousness at several levels at once. It can alter molecular signaling within individual neurons, it can change communication within local circuits, and it can disturb coordination across entire networks. What disappears is not necessarily brain activity itself, it is the particular organization of that activity. This becomes especially clear when researchers compare electrical patterns before and after loss of responsiveness. In many anesthetized states, the brain develops stronger rhythms or more stereotyped patterns. Activity may become more synchronized in some places, but less capable of carrying differentiated information across large distances. The brain can still be extremely active while becoming less flexible. That suggests consciousness may depend less on how much activity exists and more on how richly different regions can influence one another. Anesthesia awareness complicates the picture further. In rare cases, a patient may later report sounds, sensations, pressure, or fragments of experience from an operation despite appearing adequately anesthetized. There are also situations in which people may dream during anesthesia. This creates a difficult measurement problem. If a person remembers nothing afterwards, it does not necessarily prove that no experience occurred. Memory formation can itself be disrupted by anesthetic drugs. Someone might have a brief experience and then lose the ability to store it. So researchers cannot rely entirely on later reports when trying to determine whether consciousness was present. Ketamine makes this especially obvious because vivid internal experiences can occur even while the person is almost completely disconnected from the environment. The same difficulty appears in other states. A sleeping person may dream, but forget the dream within seconds of waking. A severely brain-injured patient may be conscious but unable to move. A person under anesthesia may have fragments of experience without forming lasting memories. Across all of these cases, behavior becomes an imperfect window into the mind. Anesthesia therefore offers a valuable clue. Consciousness does not seem to depend simply on whether neurons are active, nor does it appear to depend on one isolated region continuing to fire. Instead, conscious experience seems closely tied to the organization, complexity, and communication of activity across the brain. When those interactions break down, ordinary awareness can disappear, even though much of the biological machinery continues working. And because anesthesia can remove consciousness temporarily and then allow it to return, it provides something close to a controlled experiment on the boundary between experience and its absence. The deeper mystery remains. We can watch the networks fragment, we can measure the rhythms change, we can observe awareness fade, but understanding exactly why those changes remove the feeling of being present is still much harder. Sleep is often treated as the opposite of consciousness. You close your eyes, drift away from the outside world, and eventually wake up again. But the brain does not move neatly between conscious and unconscious states like a simple light switch. Across a single night, consciousness can fade, return, change form, become vivid, disappear from memory, and occasionally become aware of itself. During non-rapid eye movement sleep, the brain moves through progressively deeper stages. Sensory responsiveness falls, muscle activity changes, and large populations of neurons can begin producing slower, more synchronized patterns of electrical activity. Yet even during non-rapid eye movement sleep, experience does not necessarily vanish. When people are awakened from different stages of sleep and immediately asked what was happening in their minds, some report thoughts, images, fragments of scenes, bodily sensations, or short dreamlike experiences. Rapid eye movement sleep is even more striking. During this state, the brain can become highly active while the body remains largely disconnected from voluntary movement. Dreams may become vivid, emotional, visually elaborate, and sometimes completely absurd in ways that seem perfectly reasonable while they are happening. A person can spend what feels like several minutes wandering through an impossible building or talking to someone who has not existed for years, and only after waking does the situation begin to look slightly suspicious. Lucid dreaming adds another layer. In a lucid dream, a person becomes aware that they are dreaming while the dream continues. Some experienced lucid dreamers can even communicate with researchers through predetermined patterns of eye movement while remaining asleep. This demonstrates something important. Being disconnected from the external environment does not necessarily mean that consciousness has disappeared. The opposite problem also occurs. A person may wake from sleep and report experiencing absolutely nothing. That sounds like dreamless unconsciousness. But there is an unavoidable difficulty. Perhaps experience really was absent, or perhaps something was experienced and then forgotten before the person was questioned. Memory is not consciousness. Failing to remember an experience later does not prove that the experience never occurred. That same problem becomes far more serious when scientists study patients with severe brain injuries. A coma is a state in which a person shows no normal wakefulness and cannot be awakened into ordinary awareness. The eyes remain closed, and there is no sustained evidence of purposeful interaction with the environment. Some patients later emerge from coma, but enter what is known as unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. In this condition, the eyes may open and close. Sleep and wake cycles can return. Basic reflexes may remain. But there is little or no reliable behavioral evidence of awareness. A minimally conscious state is different. Here, a person may occasionally show signs of purposeful behavior, such as following a simple command, tracking something visually, producing an appropriate emotional response, or attempting communication. The signs may be weak or inconsistent, which makes diagnosis difficult. Then there is locked-in syndrome. A person with locked-in syndrome can be fully conscious while losing nearly all voluntary movement, usually because of damage affecting pathways through the brainstem. Some patients retain only small eye movements or blinking as a means of communication. This creates a sobering lesson. A motionless body is not necessarily an unconscious mind. The danger of judging consciousness entirely from behavior became especially clear through work led by Adrian Owen. In one influential approach, behaviorally unresponsive patients were asked to imagine performing particular activities while their brains were examined using functional magnetic resonance imaging. One task involved imagining playing tennis. Another involved imagining moving through the rooms of a familiar home. In healthy volunteers, These two forms of mental imagery activate different patterns of brain activity. In a small number of patients who showed no reliable behavioral response, the appropriate brain pattern appeared when the instruction was given. The patient was not moving. There was no spoken answer, yet the brain appeared to be following the command. This phenomenon is often described as covert consciousness or cognitive motor dissociation, depending on the clinical context and measurement being used. Stephen Lorries and researchers associated with the Coma Science Group at the University of Leiden have also worked extensively on improving the diagnosis of disorders of consciousness. Their research has highlighted how difficult it can be to distinguish a truly unconscious patient from someone who retains awareness but cannot consistently express it through movement. This has encouraged scientists to search for measurements that depend less on a person following instructions. One important approach was developed through work involving Marcello Massimini, Giulio Tononi, Adenauer Casali, and their colleagues. It is known as the Perturbational Complexity Index. The basic idea is unusual but elegant. Researchers use transcranial magnetic stimulation to deliver a brief magnetic pulse to the cerebral cortex. This produces a controlled disturbance in neural activity. Electroencephalography then records how that disturbance spreads through the brain. In ordinary waking consciousness, the response tends to be complex. Activity travels through different regions in a changing pattern. The signal is neither confined to one tiny area nor repeated identically everywhere. It is both distributed and differentiated. During deep non-rapid eye movement sleep, many forms of general anesthesia, and some severe disorders of consciousness, the response often becomes simpler. Sometimes the disturbance remains largely local. In other cases, activity spreads more widely, but in a highly repetitive or stereotyped way. The Perturbational Complexity Index attempts to capture this difference mathematically by estimating how rich and integrated the brain's response is. Higher values are generally associated with conscious states, while lower values tend to appear in states where consciousness is absent or greatly reduced. It is not a perfect consciousness meter. No such device currently exists. But it provides an important clue that conscious brains may be distinguished partly by the complexity with which different regions can influence one another. This uncertainty has very real consequences. If a patient cannot communicate, doctors still need to consider whether pain might be experienced. Families may need to make decisions about rehabilitation, treatment, and long-term care. Questions about prognosis can influence whether therapy continues and what forms of communication are attempted. In the most severe cases, assessments of consciousness can become part of discussions surrounding life-sustaining treatment. False hope can cause harm. But assuming too quickly that consciousness is absent can cause harm as well. That is why researchers increasingly combine behavioral assessment with brain imaging, electrical recordings, stimulation methods, and repeated examination over time. Sleep, dreaming, anesthesia, and brain injury all point toward the same difficult conclusion. Consciousness cannot be identified simply by asking whether someone is awake. It cannot be identified merely by movement, and it cannot always be inferred from whether a person remembers something later. Sometimes experience may still be present when the outside world has almost no way of seeing it, and once scientists accept that hidden mental processes can continue without obvious awareness, another question becomes difficult to avoid. If the brain can process information before consciousness catches up, could it also begin making decisions before we consciously know that we have made them? The feeling of making a decision is one of the most familiar parts of conscious life. You think about doing something, you decide to do it, and then your body acts. At least that is how it seems. But experiments on voluntary movement have raised an uncomfortable possibility. Some of the brain activity involved in a decision may begin before a person becomes consciously aware of deciding. One of the earliest clues came from Hans Helmut Kornhuber and Elder Dike. In the 1960s, they recorded electrical activity from the scalp, while people made self-initiated movements, such as flexing a finger or pressing a button whenever they felt like doing so. They discovered a slow build-up of electrical activity beginning before the movement itself. This signal became known as the readiness potential. It appeared to suggest that the brain was preparing an action before the action actually occurred. That was interesting, but it did not yet say very much about consciousness. The more famous question came later. Benjamin Libet designed experiments intended to compare 3 moments. The first was the beginning of the readiness potential. The second was the moment the participant became consciously aware of the intention to move. The third was the physical movement itself. Participants watched a rapidly moving spot on a clock-like display and were asked to remember where the spot was when they first became aware of wanting to move. Libet found that the readiness potential often began several hundred milliseconds before the movement. The reported conscious intention appeared later. This result quickly became famous. It was often interpreted as showing that the brain decides before the conscious mind does. According to the strongest version of that interpretation, the unconscious brain begins the action. Consciousness only becomes aware of the decision afterwards, and the feeling of consciously choosing is largely an illusion. It is a dramatic conclusion. It is also much stronger than the experiment itself demonstrated. The readiness potential showed that neural preparation began before movement. It did not prove that a complete decision had already been made, nor did Libet directly measure consciousness itself. He measured a participant's later report about when a conscious intention seemed to occur. That distinction matters. Judging the exact moment when an intention first appears is surprisingly difficult. Conscious experience does not arrive with a convenient internal timestamp. The clock method also depends on attention, memory, perception, and retrospective judgment. Small errors of a few hundred milliseconds can become very important when the entire argument depends on timing within less than a second. The actions themselves were also extremely simple. Participants were usually making arbitrary movements with very little consequence. They were not deciding whether to change careers, end a relationship, confess to a mistake, or move to another country. They were deciding when to flex a wrist or press a button. That makes the experiments valuable for studying the preparation of voluntary movement, but it makes broader claims about every form of human decision-making much more difficult. Later experiments pushed the idea further. Chun Seong-soon, Marcel Brass, Hans-Jochen Heinze, and John Dillon Haynes used functional magnetic resonance imaging, while participants freely chose between simple alternatives. Patterns of activity in parts of the frontal and parietal cortex contained information that allowed researchers to predict the eventual choice several seconds before participants reported becoming consciously aware of deciding. Again, the results sounded extraordinary. But the predictions were far from perfect. The brain activity gave researchers a statistical advantage over chance, rather than allowing them to read a settled decision with certainty. This could mean that early activity reflects a bias toward one option rather than a final commitment. The interpretation of the readiness potential itself has also changed. Aaron Scherger, Jacobo Sitt, and Stanislas Dehaene proposed an accumulator model that offers a very different picture. Neural activity naturally fluctuates. When people are told to move whenever they feel like it, without any external signal telling them exactly when, these spontaneous fluctuations may gradually approach a threshold. Once the activity crosses that threshold, the movement occurs. If researchers average many trials together, the random fluctuations can produce something that resembles a smooth build-up before the action. Under this interpretation, the readiness potential does not necessarily represent an unconscious brain quietly making a completed decision several hundred milliseconds before consciousness arrives. It may partly reflect the way spontaneous neural activity accumulates until an action is triggered. This does not mean conscious intention must be the sole cause of movement either. The evidence instead suggests that voluntary action develops through a process distributed across time. Preparation can begin before conscious awareness. Different neural systems may compete or accumulate evidence. an intention can become consciously available while the process is still unfolding. The action may then be modified, delayed, or stopped. Benjamin Libet himself became interested in the possibility of veto. He suggested that even if unconscious preparation begins first, consciousness might still have time to cancel the action before it occurs. Later experiments have explored this idea more directly. Researchers have examined how close to movement a person can receive a stop signal and still successfully cancel the action. There appears to be a point very shortly before movement when cancellation becomes extremely difficult. Before that point, however, an already developing action can sometimes still be stopped. This suggests that a decision may not be a single instant. There may be preparation, competition, conscious awareness, monitoring, inhibition, and final execution. The everyday experience of choosing could therefore represent one stage within a longer biological process rather than a tiny inner commander issuing orders from nowhere. That possibility fits comfortably with what neuroscience has already revealed about consciousness. Much of the brain's work occurs outside awareness. Perception begins before we become conscious of what we are seeing. Movements are prepared before they happen. Emotional and bodily signals can influence behavior before we can describe them, so it would not be surprising if decision-making also began before conscious awareness. What the experiments do not show is that consciousness is useless. They do not demonstrate that every important decision is settled unconsciously in advance. And they do not prove that conscious reflection has no causal influence over behavior. A person can spend hours considering evidence, imagining consequences, changing priorities, resisting impulses, and building habits that influence future decisions. Those processes are very different from deciding when to move a finger in a laboratory. The more interesting possibility is that conscious intention participates in a much larger decision system. Rather than initiating every action from nothing, consciousness may receive information from processes already underway and then contribute to evaluation, planning, inhibition, revision, and longer-term control. That raises another question. If information begins unconsciously and then becomes consciously available, what changes when it crosses that boundary? One influential answer is that consciousness begins when information stops being confined to specialized local systems and becomes available across much more of the brain. One influential way of thinking about consciousness begins with a simple observation. The brain contains many specialized systems doing different things at the same time. Some regions process color, others respond to movement, sound, memory, language, bodily state, or possible actions. Much of this activity happens without entering conscious awareness. So what changes when one piece of information becomes conscious? Bernard Baars proposed an answer through global workspace theory. He compared the mind to a theatre. Most of the work happens backstage. Large numbers of specialized processes operate outside awareness, analyzing information, preparing responses, retrieving memories, and competing for influence. Consciousness, in this picture, resembles the brightly lit stage. Only a limited amount of information can occupy it at once. But once something reaches that stage, it can be made available to many other systems across the mind. The metaphor is useful because it captures an important feature of conscious experience. At any moment, you are surrounded by vastly more information than you can consciously process. Your eyes receive details from the entire visual field. Your ears receive overlapping sounds. Your body continuously produces signals from muscles, joints, skin, organs, and balance systems. Memories and expectations are also active in the background. Yet only a small fraction of all this becomes the focus of conscious awareness. Stanislas Dehaene, Jean-Pierre Changeux, Lionel Nakache, and other researchers developed this idea into global neuronal workspace theory. The key proposal is that unconscious processing can remain relatively local. A visual stimulus, for example, may activate early sensory regions and begin traveling through parts of the visual system without becoming conscious. If the signal is weak, masked, ignored, or otherwise fails to win the competition for wider access, processing may stop there. The brain has still done something with the information, you simply do not experience it. But when a signal becomes sufficiently strong, relevant, or amplified by attention, a different pattern may emerge. Activity begins spreading through long-range connections linking distant cortical regions. Sensory areas communicate with association regions. Frontal and parietal networks become involved. The representation becomes more stable and can remain available for longer. This widespread transition is often called global ignition. The word ignition is intended to capture the sudden change from relatively restricted processing to broad neural availability. Before ignition, a stimulus may influence only a limited collection of systems. After ignition, the information can potentially be used by working memory, reasoning, planning, attention, verbal report, decision-making, and voluntary action. Imagine briefly seeing an unfamiliar shape. At first, early visual systems analyze edges, orientation, contrast, and position. Most of those computations never become conscious individually. You do not experience millions of neurons calculating boundaries. You simply see the object. According to global neuronal workspace theory, that conscious perception appears when a representation becomes sufficiently strong and broadly broadcast across the brain. Once that happens, you can remember the object, describe it, compare it with something else, make a decision about it, or deliberately act on what you saw. Several experimental methods have been used to test this idea. Visual masking is particularly useful. A stimulus can be shown extremely briefly and then interrupted by another image. Sometimes participants report seeing the first stimulus clearly. On other trials, they report no conscious perception even though early sensory processing still occurred. Researchers can then compare brain activity between the seen and unseen trials. Another technique involves the attentional blink. When visual targets appear rapidly one after another, people sometimes fail to consciously notice a second target if it appears too soon after the first. The eyes still receive it, early processing still occurs, but conscious access appears temporarily limited. Electroencephalography, intracranial recordings, and functional brain imaging have all been used to examine what happens when stimuli cross this boundary. Some experiments have found relatively late, widespread activity when a stimulus is consciously reported, compared with more limited activity when it remains unseen. Intracranial recordings can provide particularly detailed timing because electrodes placed in the brain for medical reasons can directly measure neural activity. These studies have supported the idea that conscious perception is associated with amplification and wider communication. Long-range connections are therefore central to the theory. The human cerebral cortex contains many local circuits capable of specialized processing, but frontal and parietal association regions possess extensive connections with other areas. This architecture may allow information entering the workspace to influence many different systems at once. That also connects neatly with observations from anesthesia and severe brain injury. Under many anesthetic conditions, local neural responses can survive. A sound may still trigger activity in auditory cortex. A flash of light may still produce a visual response. But communication across distant regions can become less effective. The individual pieces of the brain may continue working while their ability to share information becomes fragmented. Global neuronal workspace theory provides one possible explanation for why consciousness disappears under those conditions. The local processing remains. The global broadcast does not. The theory also offers clear experimental predictions, which is one of its major strengths. Researchers can ask when ignition occurs, they can examine which regions participate, they can compare conscious and unconscious processing, they can test whether widespread access predicts what a person can remember, report, or use in flexible behavior. But there is an important criticism. Much of the evidence for widespread frontal activity has traditionally come from experiments in which people must report what they experienced. Reporting requires attention, working memory, decision-making, and preparation of an answer. So perhaps some frontal activity does not represent consciousness itself. Perhaps it represents what the person does after becoming conscious. This is one reason no report experiments have become so important. When reporting demands are reduced, some studies find less dramatic frontal involvement. That has fueled debate over whether global ignition is necessary for experience itself or mainly for conscious access and report. And this distinction returns us to the hard problem. Suppose global neuronal workspace theory is completely correct about access. Suppose consciousness occurs whenever information becomes widely available to memory, reasoning, planning, and behavior. That would explain an enormous amount about what conscious information can do. It would explain why some signals influence us silently while others become available for flexible thought. But one question would remain. Why should globally available information feel like anything? Why should broadcasting a representation across the brain produce the experience of colour, sound, pain, or thought, rather than simply creating a more powerful form of information processing? Global neuronal workspace theory approaches consciousness from the perspective of access and communication. Another influential theory begins somewhere very different. Instead of asking how information becomes globally available, it asks what kind of physical system could possess experience in the first place. Integrated information theory begins from a very different starting point. Rather than asking first what the brain does when information becomes widely available, it begins with conscious experience itself. The theory was developed by Giulio Tononi and later expanded through work involving researchers including Melanie Bolli, Marcello Massimini, Christoph Koch, and Larissa Albantakis. Its central ambition is unusually bold. It attempts to describe the properties that every conscious experience seems to possess, and then ask what kind of physical system would need to exist in order to possess corresponding properties. The theory begins with several basic observations about experience. First, an experience exists from its own point of view. If you are looking at a dark blue sky, the experience is present for you directly. It does not need to be observed by someone else in order to exist as an experience. Second, every experience is specific. Seeing a blue sky is different from seeing a red wall, hearing a piano, remembering a childhood room, or feeling a sharp pain. The experience contains information because it is one possibility among an enormous number of alternative experiences that could have occurred instead. Third, conscious experience is unified. When you look around a room, you do not normally experience colour in one consciousness, shape in another, sound in a third, and your sense of location somewhere else entirely. They appear together as parts of one overall moment. At the same time, that moment is highly differentiated. A conscious system must be capable of occupying many different experiential states. A brain that could produce only one identical experience forever would contain very little differentiation. Integrated information theory therefore places enormous importance on two properties: differentiation and integration. A conscious system, according to the theory, must contain many possible states while also being organized so that its important parts cannot simply be divided into completely independent pieces. This is where the idea of integrated information enters. The theory attempts to quantify how much the causal structure of a system depends on the system operating as a whole rather than as a collection of separate components. This proposed quantity is commonly represented in technical discussions by a Greek letter, but the important idea is simply the amount of integrated information generated by the system. It is not something that doctors can currently measure from the brain in a few seconds with a convenient handheld device. The full mathematical framework becomes extremely demanding even for relatively small systems. Instead, the concept is best understood as an attempt to describe how much irreducible causal structure exists within a network. Imagine two systems that produce the same outward behavior. Both receive an input. Both perform a calculation. Both produce the same answer. From the outside, they appear identical. But internally, One system might consist largely of feed-forward pathways, with information moving through a sequence of stages and very little influence travelling back. The other might contain dense recurrent connections in which many parts continuously influence one another. Integrated information theory argues that these systems need not possess the same amount of consciousness, even if their input and output behaviour is similar. What matters is not only what the system does. What matters is the intrinsic causal organisation of the system itself. This creates one of the clearest differences between integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace theory. Global neuronal workspace theory focuses heavily on information becoming widely available for memory, reasoning, planning, report, and flexible behaviour. Integrated information theory focuses instead on the internal causal structure that exists within a system, regardless of whether an outside observer can see the result. This difference also affects where researchers expect to find the most important neural activity. Work associated with integrated information theory has placed particular emphasis on posterior regions of the cerebral cortex. These include parts of the parietal, temporal, and occipital cortex involved in constructing the detailed contents of perception. This has sometimes been described as a posterior cortical hot zone. The suggestion is that the physical substrate supporting the contents of conscious experience may be concentrated more heavily toward the back of the cortex than in frontal regions associated with planning, report, and executive control. This idea fits with some experiments showing that damage or activity in posterior cortical areas can strongly affect what people experience, but it remains debated. Researchers studying consciousness have also developed practical measurements that appear loosely related to some of the ideas behind integration and differentiation. The perturbational complexity index is one example. By stimulating the cortex and measuring how complex the resulting activity becomes, researchers can estimate whether the brain responds in a rich, distributed, and differentiated way. Conscious states tend to produce more complex responses than many unconscious states, but the perturbational complexity index is not a direct measurement of the integrated information proposed by the theory. The two ideas are related in spirit, but they are not interchangeable. A clinically useful measure of brain complexity does not amount to a complete calculation of integrated information, and this leads directly to one of the largest criticisms of the theory. The mathematics can become extraordinarily difficult. Calculating the full causal structure of even moderately complicated networks can require enormous amounts of computation. For a human brain containing tens of billions of neurons and vastly more connections, an exact calculation is far beyond what researchers can realistically perform. There are conceptual criticisms as well. Some scientists and philosophers question whether the theory's starting principles about experience necessarily lead to its physical conclusions. Others argue that the framework can attribute significant forms of consciousness to systems that many people would intuitively consider far too simple. This does not automatically make the theory wrong. Human intuition is hardly a perfect scientific instrument. But counterintuitive predictions become important when a theory claims to identify consciousness itself. Questions have also been raised about testability. A scientific theory must eventually make predictions that could prove it mistaken. If a framework can reinterpret almost any result after the fact, then it becomes difficult to distinguish scientific explanation from a very elaborate description. Supporters of integrated information theory argue that it does make specific predictions about causal structure, integration, and the neural basis of conscious contents. Critics remain unconvinced that the most fundamental claims can yet be tested decisively, and even if the theory successfully identifies a property that always accompanies consciousness, the hard problem has not necessarily disappeared. Suppose conscious systems always contain highly integrated causal structures. Why should integrated causal structure feel like anything? Why should one form of physical organization produce color, pain, warmth, memory, or emotion from the inside? Perhaps integrated information is the bridge that eventually answers that question. Or perhaps it is another extremely important property of conscious brains that still stops just short of explaining experience itself. This is why comparing theories matters so much. Global neuronal workspace theory emphasizes widespread broadcasting. Integrated information theory emphasizes intrinsic causal integration. Both can point to evidence. Both make predictions. And both claim to capture something fundamental about consciousness. The most revealing experiment, then, is not one designed by supporters of either theory to confirm what they already expect. It is an experiment in which the theories are placed directly against each other and asked to make different predictions about the same brain. Global neuronal workspace theory and integrated information theory are two of the most influential modern attempts to explain consciousness, but they are far from the only ones. In fact, one of the reasons consciousness remains so difficult to explain is that researchers do not even agree on which part of the problem deserves to be treated as fundamental. Some theories focus on recurrent communication inside sensory systems. Others focus on whether the brain represents its own mental states. Some emphasize prediction. Some emphasize attention. Others begin with the body itself. Victor Lamb's recurrent processing theory starts with the way information moves through sensory cortex. When visual information first enters the brain, signals travel forward through a series of processing stages. This is often described as feed-forward processing. A stimulus reaches early visual regions, and information then moves onward toward areas involved in recognizing more complex features. But neural signaling does not only move forward. Later regions send activity back toward earlier ones. Different layers and neighboring regions exchange information repeatedly. This recurrent processing creates loops of interaction rather than a simple one-way chain. Victor Lamy has argued that this recurrent exchange may be crucial for phenomenal consciousness. On this view, a visual stimulus can be processed unconsciously during an initial feed-forward sweep. Conscious experience may emerge when recurrent activity develops within sensory cortex. Importantly, this may happen before information becomes globally available for deliberate report, reasoning, or voluntary action. That places recurrent processing theory in an interesting position. It suggests that phenomenal experience may arise relatively locally, while wider broadcasting may be necessary mainly for conscious access. In other words, you might experience something before you can describe it, remember it clearly, or deliberately act on it. Higher-order theories begin somewhere else. Researchers including David Rosenthal, Hakwon Lau, Richard Brown, and Joseph Ledoux have developed different versions of the idea that a mental state becomes conscious when the brain in some sense represents itself as being in that state. The distinction is between first-order and higher-order representation. A first-order representation might encode the colour of an object, the sound of a tone, or the sensation produced by pressure on the skin. But according to higher-order approaches, that representation alone may remain unconscious. For it to become conscious, the system must also possess some further representation, indicating that it is seeing, hearing, or feeling that content. The brain is not only representing the world, it is, in some sense, representing its own relationship to the world. This has an intuitive appeal. Consciousness often seems to involve not merely information, but awareness that information is present. Yet the theory immediately faces a familiar question. If one representation is unconscious, why should adding another representation suddenly create experience? A higher-order model may explain confidence, introspection, or the ability to report a mental state. Whether it explains why the state feels like anything remains debated. Predictive processing approaches take a broader view of perception itself. Carl Friston has been highly influential in developing mathematical frameworks in which the brain is treated as a system that continuously generates predictions about the causes of incoming sensory signals. Anil Seth has applied related ideas directly to consciousness and perception. The brain, in this picture, does not passively wait for the world to impress itself upon the senses. It continually forms models of what is likely to be out there. Incoming sensory information is then compared with those predictions. Differences between expectation and sensory input can be used to update the model. Perception becomes a controlled process of inference. Anil Seth has memorably described conscious perception as a controlled hallucination. The phrase can sound more dramatic than the idea really is. It does not mean that ordinary perception is equivalent to clinical hallucination. The important word is controlled. Your brain may generate predictions, but those predictions are continuously constrained by signals arriving from the eyes, ears, skin, internal organs, and other sensory systems. If the world strongly disagrees with the brain's prediction, the model usually has to change. What we experience may therefore depend partly on the brain's best current interpretation of uncertain sensory evidence. Michael Graziano's attention schema theory approaches consciousness through attention. Attention allows the nervous system to prioritize some information over other competing information. But controlling attention is itself a difficult computational problem. According to attention schema theory, the brain constructs a simplified internal model of its own attentional processes. This model helps the system predict and control what it is attending to. The theory proposes that what we call awareness may arise from this internal model. The brain represents itself as possessing awareness because that representation is useful for controlling attention and understanding other minds. It is somewhat like the simplified model your brain constructs of your own body. You do not need to know the exact position of every muscle fibre in order to move your arm. A useful summary is enough. In the same way, the brain may not represent every physical detail of attention. It may construct a simpler description that appears to us as awareness. Antonio Damasio has emphasized yet another dimension. For Damasio, understanding consciousness requires paying close attention to the living body. The brain is constantly receiving signals from the heart, lungs, digestive system, muscles, skin, blood vessels, and internal chemical environment. This perception of the internal body is known as interoception. Damasio's work connects consciousness with bodily regulation, emotion, feeling, and the construction of increasingly complex forms of selfhood. Before a person can possess an autobiographical identity with memories, plans, and a name, the nervous system must already be regulating a living organism. The brain must maintain temperature, energy balance, circulation, breathing, and countless other variables within ranges compatible with survival. According to this broad family of ideas, consciousness may be deeply connected to the brain's representation of the organism as a living body. These theories can sound as though they are all trying to answer the same question, but often they are not. Recurrent processing theory focuses heavily on when sensory representations become phenomenally conscious. Higher-order theories focus on awareness of mental states. Predictive processing focuses on how perception is constructed from models and sensory evidence. Attention schema theory focuses on the brain's model of attention. Damasio places strong emphasis on bodily regulation, emotion, and selfhood. Global neuronal workspace theory focuses on large-scale access and broadcasting. Integrated information theory focuses on intrinsic causal integration. It is entirely possible that several of these accounts describe genuine features of consciousness at different levels. A conscious brain may use prediction, recurrent processing, attention, global broadcasting, bodily regulation, and self-representation all at once. The difficult part is deciding which of these processes are merely associated with consciousness and which are fundamental to it. This creates a danger known as conceptual slippage. A theory may successfully explain attention and then quietly treat attention as consciousness. It may explain reportability and assume that reportability is experience. It may explain confidence, memory, self-monitoring, or perception, and then move from solving one of those problems to claiming that consciousness itself has been explained. That is why clear experimental predictions matter so much. If two theories can both explain any possible result, then comparing them achieves very little. The stronger approach is to force them to disagree in advance. Researchers can specify which brain regions should become active, when particular signals should appear, what kind of connectivity should occur, and what findings would count against each theory. Then the same experiment can test those predictions under the same conditions. For a field filled with competing explanations, that kind of direct confrontation is extremely valuable, because eventually consciousness theories have to do more than sound convincing. They have to risk being wrong. For many years, one of the quiet problems in consciousness research was that different theories were often tested in different ways. A research group might design an experiment around the predictions of its preferred theory, choose particular measurements, focus on particular brain regions, and then interpret the results through that same theoretical framework. Another group could do something similar with a competing theory. Both sides might accumulate evidence that appeared supportive, and yet the theories themselves were rarely forced into a situation where they had to make clearly different predictions about the same experiment. This is a familiar difficulty in science. If a theory is flexible enough, almost any result can be explained after the fact. The solution is to make the predictions first. That is the idea behind adversarial collaboration. Instead of researchers working only within their own camps, supporters of competing explanations agree in advance on what should happen if their theory is correct. They also agree on methods, measurements, analysis procedures, and which results would count as a serious challenge. That changes the tone of the experiment. The goal is no longer simply to gather more evidence for one preferred view. The goal is to create a situation in which the theories can genuinely disagree. One of the largest efforts to do this in consciousness research came from the Cogitate Consortium. The project brought together researchers from different institutions and theoretical backgrounds in an international open science collaboration. It included theory proponents, theory-neutral researchers, pre-registered predictions, shared experimental procedures, and analysis plans designed before the final results were known. Researchers involved in developing or evaluating the work included Lucia Maloney, Liad Mudrik, Michael Pitts, Christoph Koch, Giulio Tononi, Stanislas Dehaene, and a much wider group of collaborators. The central comparison focused on two theories that had already become major rivals: integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace theory. 256 human participants took part in the study. They viewed clearly visible images while researchers examined what happened in the brain. To avoid relying on one single measurement technique, the collaboration used three complementary methods. Functional magnetic resonance imaging provided information about which brain regions were active across relatively large areas. Magnetoencephalography provided extremely fine timing information by detecting magnetic fields associated with neural activity. Intracranial electroencephalography provided direct recordings from electrodes placed inside the brain in participants who already had those electrodes for medical reasons. This combination allowed researchers to examine both where activity occurred and how it unfolded over time. The theories made different predictions. Integrated information theory placed particular emphasis on posterior regions of the cerebral cortex. It predicted that the contents of conscious perception would be represented through sustained activity in these posterior areas and through particular patterns of connectivity among them. Global neuronal workspace theory placed stronger emphasis on widespread broadcasting. It predicted that conscious information would trigger a characteristic ignition, involving a distributed network that included prefrontal regions, making the information broadly available across the brain. The experiment therefore offered something unusually valuable. Instead of asking whether either theory could explain some aspect of the data after the experiment had finished, researchers could compare the results with predictions specified beforehand. The findings were complicated, and scientifically, that was precisely what made them interesting. Information about conscious visual content could be detected in visual regions, ventrotemporal areas, and parts of the inferior frontal cortex. Sustained neural responses were observed in occipital and lateral temporal regions. Researchers also found some synchronization between frontal areas and early visual cortex. At first glance, pieces of these findings could be interpreted as favorable to both theories, but several of the more specific predictions did not fare as well. Integrated information theory had expected stronger sustained synchronization within posterior cortical regions. That predicted pattern was not observed in the way the theory required. Global neuronal workspace theory, meanwhile, had predicted stronger evidence for certain forms of global ignition and more robust conscious content representation in prefrontal regions. Those expectations were also only partly supported. The result was not the clean victory that either side might have hoped for. There was no dramatic moment where one theory collapsed and the other emerged triumphant. Instead, important predictions from both frameworks were challenged. This can sound slightly disappointing if consciousness research is imagined as a competition in which one theory must eventually hold up a trophy. In reality, it is exactly what a strong scientific test should be able to do. A useful experiment should have the power to make researchers uncomfortable. If every result confirms a theory, then the theory may not be risking very much. By contrast, a study that forces both sides to revise important assumptions can move the field forward even without producing a final winner. The Cogitate collaboration was important for another reason. It demonstrated a way of working that reduces some of the flexibility that has historically made consciousness theories difficult to compare. Predictions were pre-registered, different laboratories contributed different forms of expertise, methods were coordinated, the analyses were designed to be transparent, and rival theories were evaluated using the same basic experimental framework. That does not mean the experiment settled the debate. Far from it. Supporters and critics can still disagree about whether the study tested the deepest claims of integrated information theory and global neuronal workspace theory, or only selected predictions about conscious visual perception. A theory of consciousness is much broader than a single experiment involving visible images. Consciousness includes pain, memory, emotion, bodily sensation, dreaming, selfhood, thought, and countless other forms of experience. A test involving visual perception may therefore reveal weaknesses in particular mechanisms without exhausting everything a theory claims. There is also the question of scale. A theory may make claims about the fundamental basis of experience, while an experiment is forced to measure indirect neural signals at a much coarser level. That gap between theory and measurement remains difficult. Still, the larger lesson is encouraging. Consciousness science is becoming more willing to expose its theories to genuinely difficult tests. The field is moving away from simply collecting supportive examples and toward asking which predictions survive when rival ideas are placed under the same conditions. And the outcome so far is not that scientists have discovered the final explanation of consciousness. It is that some of the leading explanations appear less complete than their strongest versions once suggested. That may sound like a step backward. In science, it is often the opposite. Knowing precisely where a theory fails can be more valuable than finding another result that vaguely agrees with it. The mystery of consciousness remains, but the questions being asked are becoming sharper, and sometimes, before a problem can be solved, science first has to become much better at proving its favourite answers wrong. One of the most convincing things about conscious experience is the feeling that there is a single self at the centre of it. You seem to be located somewhere behind your eyes. Your body feels like your body. Your memories feel like your past. Your decisions feel like your decisions. And across the years, despite enormous changes in appearance, mood, beliefs, relationships, and circumstance, there is usually a powerful sense that the person experiencing this moment is somehow the same person who experienced earlier ones. But consciousness and self-consciousness are not the same thing. A creature might have sensations, pain, colour, sound, or emotion, without possessing an elaborate concept of itself as an individual with a name, biography, reputation, and long-term plans. Even in humans, the sense of self appears to be built from several partly separable components. There is bodily ownership, the feeling that a particular hand or foot belongs to you. There is self-location, the sense of where you are positioned in space. There is agency, the feeling that you are causing your own actions. There is autobiographical memory, connecting the present with events from the past. There is personality, social identity, and the impression of continuing through time as one individual. These usually fit together so smoothly that they feel like one indivisible thing. Experiments suggest otherwise. Matthew Botvinnik and Jonathan Cohen demonstrated this beautifully with the rubber hand illusion. In the classic experiment, a participant's real hand is hidden from view, while a realistic artificial hand is placed where it can be seen. The researcher then strokes the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand at the same time in matching locations. After a short period, many people begin to experience something peculiar. The rubber hand starts to feel as though it belongs to them. They know perfectly well that it is made of rubber. They can remember sitting down moments earlier with only the usual number of biological hands. And yet the brain begins incorporating the artificial object into its model of the body. The illusion becomes weaker, when the timing or position of the touches no longer matches. This suggests that bodily ownership is not simply read from a permanent internal label saying this limb belongs to me. The brain appears to infer ownership by combining vision, touch, position, and expectation. When those signals agree strongly enough, the model can be altered. Self-location can be disturbed as well. Olaf Blanke and colleagues have studied neurological conditions and experimental manipulations involving out-of-body experiences. Particular disturbances around the temporoparietal junction, where information from vision, touch, balance, and body position is brought together, can alter where a person feels located. Someone may experience the strange impression of viewing their own body from somewhere outside it. The experience can feel completely real, even though the physical body has not moved. This does not require a mind literally leaving the body. It suggests instead that the brain normally performs an enormous amount of hidden work to maintain a stable estimate of where the self is. Antonio Damasio has argued that the foundations of selfhood begin even deeper, with the brain's continuous regulation and representation of the living organism. Damasio distinguishes ideas including the proto-self, core consciousness, and autobiographical self. The proto-self refers to basic neural representations of the body's ongoing condition. The nervous system must continuously monitor temperature, breathing, circulation, energy balance, internal chemistry, and signals from organs and tissues. Core consciousness adds a more immediate sense of an organism interacting with objects and events. The autobiographical self is richer still, incorporating memory, personality, relationships, goals, and personal history. On this view, the sophisticated human sense of identity grows from more basic systems that first keep track of the body. Anil Seth has developed related ideas through interoception and predictive processing. Interoception is the brain's processing of signals arising from within the body. Heartbeat, breathing, hunger, internal temperature, gut activity, and many other physiological signals constantly provide information about the organism's condition. The brain does not simply receive these signals passively. It predicts, interprets, and regulates them. The experienced self may therefore depend partly on a continuously updated model of the living body. The sense of being a stable person may feel effortless, precisely because the modelling process is normally invisible. Thomas Metzinger takes the idea further through self-model theory. According to this view, the self we experience is not a separate inner object hidden somewhere inside the brain. It is a model constructed by the brain. And importantly, the model is transparent. We experience the world through it without usually noticing the machinery that created it. You do not normally experience your brain constructing a model of your body. You simply experience having a body. You do not experience a neural calculation locating you behind your eyes. You simply feel as though that is where you are. This avoids a classic problem known as the homunculus problem. It can be tempting to imagine perception as though there were a tiny observer sitting somewhere inside the head, watching a screen fed by the senses. But that solves nothing. Who is watching the screen inside the tiny observer's head? Eventually, the explanation has to stop placing another observer inside the previous one. Modern neuroscience instead treats perception and selfhood as processes performed by networks themselves. Clinical conditions reveal how many pieces of the self can come apart. Severe memory loss can destroy large portions of autobiographical continuity, while leaving immediate conscious experience intact. Depersonalization can produce a disturbing sense of detachment from one's thoughts, emotions, or body. After certain brain injuries, spatial neglect can cause a person to behave as though one side of space barely exists. People with phantom limbs may vividly feel a hand or foot that has been physically removed. In anosognosia, a patient may deny or appear unaware of a serious impairment such as paralysis. None of these conditions necessarily eliminates consciousness as a whole. Instead, they selectively alter ingredients that normally contribute to the ordinary sense of being a unified self. That points toward a rather unusual conclusion. The self may be real as an experience without existing as a single, fixed object inside the brain. It may be a biological construction assembled from bodily signals, memory, perception, prediction, agency, and social information. And because the construction is constantly maintained, it usually feels solid and obvious. But explaining how the brain builds a model of the self still does not solve the deepest problem. A model is still physical activity. Signals are still passing through neural networks. Representations are still being constructed. Why should any of that be experienced from the inside? The brain may explain how the sense of self is organised without yet explaining why there is a conscious point of view to which that self appears. And that distinction becomes especially important when considering minds that may possess experience without language, autobiography, or anything resembling an adult human identity. Consciousness becomes especially difficult to study when the person experiencing it cannot tell us what is happening. Adults can describe what they see, hear, remember, or feel. Infants cannot. A newborn cannot explain whether a colour looks vivid, whether a sound feels familiar, or whether a face is recognised as belonging to someone important. They cannot follow complicated instructions, press a button at exactly the right moment, or describe the contents of their own awareness. This creates a basic scientific problem. An inability to communicate is not the same thing as an absence of consciousness. That lesson appears repeatedly in neuroscience. A person with locked-in syndrome may be fully aware but almost completely unable to move. A patient with severe brain injury may show signs of hidden awareness only through brain imaging. Someone under anesthesia may later remember nothing even if fragments of experience occurred. So when an infant cannot provide a report, silence tells us very little by itself. Researchers have therefore had to find indirect ways of studying early awareness. Scientists including Ghislaine Dehaene-Lamberts, Sid Kuida, Stanislas Dehaene, and many other developmental researchers have examined how infant brains respond to sights, sounds, faces, voices, and unexpected events. Some methods are wonderfully simple. Researchers can measure where a baby looks. If an infant repeatedly sees the same image, attention often decreases over time. This is known as habituation. If a new image suddenly appears and the infant looks for longer again, the change suggests that the nervous system distinguished the new stimulus from the familiar one. Researchers can also monitor pupil size. The pupils respond not only to light, but also to attention, surprise, arousal, and cognitive effort. Tiny changes can therefore provide clues about how strongly an infant is processing an event. Brain activity offers another window. Electrical recordings from the scalp can reveal when the infant brain responds to a sound, a face, or an unexpected pattern. Some researchers have looked for delayed neural signatures that resemble responses associated with conscious processing in adults. The interpretation has to remain cautious, because an infant brain is not simply a smaller adult brain. Its networks are still developing, but these measurements show that surprisingly sophisticated processing begins very early. Newborns can distinguish familiar voices from unfamiliar ones. They show sensitivity to speech patterns. Young infants respond differently to faces than to many other visual objects. They can detect regularities in sounds and images. They can notice when an expected pattern is violated. Even very young brains can form limited memories and use information from previous events to influence later behaviour. None of this automatically proves adult-like consciousness. A nervous system can process complex information without conscious experience, as experiments on blindsight, masking, and unconscious perception have already shown. So researchers have to resist an easy temptation. If a baby performs an impressive task, that does not mean the infant experiences the world exactly as an adult does. The better question is how different capacities emerge over time. Long-range connections across the cerebral cortex continue developing after birth. Attention becomes more controlled. Working memory expands. Language changes what information can be represented, combined, and communicated. Metacognition, the ability to think about one's own thinking, develops gradually. Autobiographical memory becomes richer. Children slowly acquire an explicit concept of themselves as individuals with a personal history extending through time. These abilities are important, but they may not be necessary for the most basic forms of consciousness. A newborn may not possess a narrative identity. There may be no elaborate inner autobiography. The infant may not be able to reflect on the fact that it is having an experience, and yet it may still have sensations. There may still be something it is like to experience warmth, discomfort, hunger, touch, light, or the sound of a familiar voice. This leads to an important distinction. Basic sensory or affective consciousness may appear before reflective self-awareness. A creature might feel without knowing that it feels. It might see without possessing the concept of seeing. It might experience distress without being able to think, "I am a person who is currently distressed." If that is correct, consciousness may emerge in layers rather than arriving all at once. The question becomes even more uncertain before birth. Fetal consciousness is scientifically difficult because the developing nervous system changes enormously across gestation. The cerebral cortex is still forming. Connections between the thalamus and cortex develop gradually. Brainstem arousal systems mature over time. Patterns resembling sleep and wake states change as development progresses. The sensory environment inside the uterus is also very different from the world after birth. The fetus receives sound, touch, movement, chemical signals, and changing light levels. But all of this occurs within a highly regulated biological environment. The chemical conditions of the womb may also promote sleep-like states and reduced arousal for much of development. For these reasons, scientists remain cautious about assigning a precise moment when conscious experience begins. There is no single switch that can be observed turning on. The nervous system develops continuously. Different components associated with consciousness appear at different times. Sensory pathways mature. Cortical networks become more organized. Long-distance communication increases. Cycles of arousal change. The capacity for memory, attention, and coordinated processing expands. Because no single measurement provides a complete answer, researchers rely on converging evidence. Behavior matters, brain activity matters, anatomy matters, physiological state matters, developmental timing matters. But no one gaze pattern, electrical signal, or response to surprise can serve as an unquestionable consciousness detector. This is a broader lesson that reaches far beyond infancy. Adult humans have made verbal reports seem like the natural standard for consciousness, because language is our most convenient way of sharing experience. But language is only one method of communication. Consciousness may not require words. It may not require an autobiographical self. It may not require the ability to explain what is being experienced. Infants make that clear because there is almost certainly a large distance between having an experience and being able to describe one. And once language is removed as the deciding test, the boundaries of consciousness become much less comfortable. The question can no longer be limited to human beings who can tell us what they feel. It must also include minds built differently from our own, with different brains, different senses, and no possibility of ever describing their inner world in words. Once we stop treating language as the test for consciousness, another difficult question appears almost immediately. Which other animals have experiences of their own? For most species, there is no way to ask. A dog cannot describe what pain feels like. A crow cannot explain whether it experiences the color of the sky. An octopus cannot tell us whether exploring a new object feels interesting. So scientists have to infer consciousness indirectly. They look at behavior, learning, memory, flexible decision-making, nervous system organization, responses to injury, attention, emotional states, and the way animals respond when uncertain about the world around them. This creates two opposite dangers. The first is anthropomorphism. That means projecting human thoughts, emotions, and intentions too freely onto other animals. A dog looking guilty does not necessarily possess the same reflective feeling of guilt that a human might describe after doing something wrong. The second danger is anthropodenial. This is the assumption that because an animal is not human, behavior that looks flexible, emotional, or purposeful must somehow be mechanically empty. Good science has to avoid both extremes. With mammals, the evidence for conscious experience is particularly strong. Humans share large parts of their nervous system organization with other mammals. Brain regions involved in pain, emotion, attention, memory, and arousal have clear evolutionary relationships across species. Mammals learn from experience, alter behavior when injured, form long-term social relationships, pursue rewards, avoid threats, and adapt their actions when circumstances change. Birds provide an especially useful reminder that consciousness may not require a mammalian-style brain. Their brains are organized differently, yet many species show remarkably sophisticated cognition. Irene Pepperberg's work with the African grey parrot Alex demonstrated impressive abilities involving colours, shapes, materials, quantities, and categories. Alex could use learned vocal labels in ways that went far beyond simply repeating sounds. Corvids provide another striking example. Nicola Clayton and colleagues have studied scrub jays and related birds capable of remembering what they stored, where they stored it, and in some circumstances how long ago the event occurred. Corvids can also alter catching behaviour depending on whether another bird might have observed them, and some studies suggest forms of future-oriented planning. These abilities do not prove consciousness by themselves, but they make it increasingly difficult to dismiss bird cognition as simple reflex. Fish are more controversial. For a long time, fish were sometimes treated as creatures with relatively simple inner lives. Research has complicated that view. Fish can learn complicated associations, recognize individuals, alter behavior according to social conditions, navigate large environments, and make trade-offs between competing motivations. After potentially damaging stimulation, some species show prolonged behavioral changes and avoidance. Researchers continue to debate exactly how these findings should be interpreted, particularly when discussing pain. A reflexive reaction to injury is not automatically proof of conscious suffering. But when animals alter priorities, learn to avoid places associated with harmful events, and change behavior for extended periods, the possibility of subjective experience becomes harder to ignore. Then there are cephalopods. Octopuses and cuttlefish are particularly fascinating because their nervous systems evolved along a very different path from vertebrate brains. Researchers including Jennifer Mather, Peter Godfrey Smith and Alexandra Schnell have examined their flexible behavior. Octopuses explore unfamiliar objects, solve problems, learn routes, manipulate their surroundings, and sometimes display behavior interpreted as play-like. A large proportion of an octopus's neurons are distributed through its arms, rather than concentrated entirely in the central brain. Each arm has considerable local processing ability, yet the animal can still produce coordinated, flexible behavior. Cuttlefish show sophisticated camouflage, learning, memory, and decision-making. Some experiments suggest that they can delay an immediately available reward when waiting produces something they prefer. Again, intelligence and consciousness are not identical. But cephalopods demonstrate that complex behavior can arise from nervous systems built very differently from ours. Decapod crustaceans such as crabs, lobsters, and crayfish have also received increasing attention. Robert Elwood and colleagues have studied how these animals respond to harmful stimulation. An important distinction is made between a simple nociceptive reflex and behavior suggesting a more complex negative state. In some experiments, crustaceans have learned to avoid locations where they previously received unpleasant stimulation. They can make motivational trade-offs, abandoning desirable shelters when the cost of remaining becomes sufficiently high. Some show prolonged rubbing or guarding of affected body regions. These findings do not allow us to enter the animal's experience, but they provide evidence that the response may involve more than a momentary reflex. Even insects have entered the debate. Lars Chitka and other researchers have demonstrated that bees are capable of impressive learning, navigation, memory, discrimination, and flexible problem-solving. Bees can learn abstract relationships, respond to quantities in limited ways, and remember complex routes through an environment. Experiments have also investigated play-like behavior. In one study, bumblebees repeatedly rolled small wooden balls even when there was no obvious food reward for doing so. Other work has examined whether positive or negative experiences can shift how bees interpret ambiguous situations in ways that resemble simple, affective biases. None of this settles whether a bee has an inner life. It does, however, make the boundary increasingly difficult to draw. Scientific opinion has shifted alongside this evidence. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, released in 2012, argued that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates associated with consciousness, and highlighted mammals, birds, and other animals including octopuses. The New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, published in 2024, went further in clarifying the current state of evidence. It stated that there is strong scientific support for conscious experience in mammals and birds. It also argued that there is at least a realistic possibility of conscious experience in all vertebrates and in several groups of invertebrates, including cephalopods, decapod crustaceans, and insects. Researchers and philosophers involved in the declaration, including Kristin Andrews, Jonathan Birch, and Jeff Sebo, emphasized an important ethical principle. If there is a realistic possibility that an animal is conscious, then that possibility should matter when decisions affecting its welfare are made. Absolute proof may be unavailable. But waiting for perfect certainty before considering suffering can carry its own risk. The deeper scientific implication is just as important. If consciousness exists in animals with brains very different from ours, then a theory of consciousness cannot simply identify one piece of specifically human anatomy and declare the problem solved. A human-style cerebral cortex may not be required. Language may not be required. High-level reasoning may not be required. An elaborate autobiographical identity may not be required. What may matter instead are more general properties such as recurrent processing, integration, flexible learning, internal modeling, coordinated information sharing, or some combination we have not yet identified. Animal consciousness therefore expands the mystery rather than narrowing it. The question is no longer only how one particular human brain creates experience. It becomes a question about what kinds of organized biological systems are capable of having a point of view at all. And after decades of experiments across humans, mammals, birds, fish, cephalopods, crustaceans, and insects, science has become increasingly sophisticated at identifying where consciousness might exist. What it still cannot do is explain why any of these nervous systems should produce experience in the first place. For all the uncertainty surrounding consciousness, it would be wrong to imagine that science has made no progress. Quite the opposite. Researchers now know far more about the brain states associated with conscious experience than they did only a few decades ago. Conscious states tend to involve particular patterns of cortical complexity. Recurrent processing appears important. Large-scale communication across distant brain regions often changes when consciousness fades. Sensory representations can remain active even when awareness disappears. Brainstem arousal systems help maintain the conditions required for ordinary waking consciousness. And information that reaches awareness often becomes available for flexible behavior, memory, reasoning, and report in ways that unconscious information does not. These are genuine discoveries. The difficulty is that none of them, on its own, explains why consciousness exists. There is an important difference between detecting consciousness and explaining it. A doctor might detect signs of awareness in a patient who cannot move. That is a major clinical achievement. Researchers might predict whether a person will report seeing an image from a particular pattern of brain activity. That is scientifically useful. An anesthetist can manipulate consciousness by administering drugs that change communication throughout the nervous system. That is one of the most remarkable practical achievements in modern medicine. But detection, prediction, and manipulation answer different questions from explanation. Knowing how to switch something off does not necessarily tell you what that thing fundamentally is. Human beings understood how to breed plants and animals long before they understood the molecular basis of heredity. Physicians could observe infectious disease long before microorganisms and immune mechanisms were understood in detail. For centuries, living organisms seemed to possess mysterious properties that could not easily be reduced to chemistry and physics. Later discoveries revealed mechanisms that had simply been invisible. Consciousness may eventually follow a similar path. Perhaps the hard problem feels impossible because neuroscience has not yet reached the necessary level of detail. There may be principles of neural organization that researchers have only begun to uncover. The relevant processes may depend on interactions across many spatial and temporal scales, from individual neurons and synapses to recurrent circuits, thalamocortical loops, and whole brain networks. A future theory might connect these levels so naturally that some of today's confusion begins to disappear. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the missing ingredient is not merely more detail. Perhaps the concepts themselves are inadequate. Current theories often describe consciousness using ideas such as information, integration, representation, broadcasting, prediction, attention, or causal structure. These are useful scientific concepts, but none has yet produced a broadly accepted bridge between physical organization and subjective experience. A new framework might be required. It could turn out that consciousness relates to physical systems in a way that existing neuroscience does not yet describe cleanly. That would not necessarily require exotic physics or anything supernatural. Science has repeatedly discovered new, explanatory levels while remaining entirely within the natural world. There is also a more radical possibility. Some philosophers and scientists argue that the hard problem may partly arise from mistaken intuitions. Perhaps we imagine consciousness as something separate from brain activity because experience presents itself in a particularly misleading way. The self feels like a single observer. Thoughts feel as though they belong to an inner subject. Qualities such as redness or pain seem fundamentally different from electrical signals and chemical interactions. Maybe that apparent divide reflects limitations in how the brain represents its own processes. If so, the hard problem might eventually weaken as our concepts of mind and brain become more precise. But critics of this view make an equally important objection. Explaining why we talk about consciousness is not obviously the same as explaining consciousness. Explaining attention does not automatically explain experience. Explaining memory, report, self-modeling, or flexible behavior does not necessarily explain why any of those functions have a felt quality. If a theory describes everything the brain does while quietly leaving out what experience feels like, then the central mystery may simply have been renamed rather than solved. Measurement makes the problem even harder. Every consciousness experiment relies on some kind of evidence. A person might give a verbal report. They might press a button. Their eyes might move. Their pupils might change. A brain scan might show activity in a particular region. Electrical recordings might reveal a particular pattern. A stimulation experiment might alter perception. But each method brings assumptions with it. A verbal report requires memory, language, and movement. Behavior can disappear even when awareness remains. A brain signal may correlate with consciousness without causing it. A physiological marker may behave differently in different states. There is no direct instrument that simply displays the amount or contents of consciousness in the way a thermometer displays temperature. This makes competing theories difficult to compare. Some theories focus on phenomenal experience. Others focus on conscious access. Some emphasize perception. Others emphasize self-awareness or global availability. Two theories can therefore appear to disagree while partly describing different phenomena. And if a theory can be modified after every unexpected result, it becomes increasingly difficult to test. For this reason, consciousness research has begun placing greater emphasis on pre-registered predictions, open data, multi-laboratory replication, adversarial collaboration, improved no-report methods, and experiments involving causal brain stimulation. Researchers are also comparing consciousness across many different conditions: wakefulness, sleep, dreaming, general anesthesia, severe brain injury, early development, and increasingly other animal species. Each condition removes some abilities while preserving others. Together, they help reveal which properties are consistently associated with experience. A successful theory will need to do more than fit the existing evidence. It should make predictions that could genuinely prove it wrong. It should explain changes in the level of consciousness and changes in the contents of experience. It should work in people who cannot speak. Ideally, it should apply across different species and different nervous systems, and somehow it must connect objective physical mechanisms with subjective qualities. That last requirement remains the hardest. Artificial systems make the problem even more obvious. A sufficiently advanced machine might speak fluently about emotions, describe colours, solve problems, remember conversations, and insist that it is conscious. But outward behaviour alone would not settle whether there is actually something it feels like to be that system. At present, there is no universally accepted scientific test for inner experience in an artificial system. The same uncertainty that complicates the study of animals and unresponsive patients becomes even more severe when the underlying machinery is entirely different from a biological brain. So the current scientific position is both impressive and incomplete. No single brain region has been identified as the unique source of consciousness. No neurotransmitter explains it. No particular electrical frequency has solved it. No computation, information measure, or philosophical argument has achieved broad agreement. Leading theories capture important parts of the evidence, but none has become a universally accepted explanation of how subjective experience arises. That is not an admission that science has failed. It is a statement about where the evidence currently ends. Science progresses partly by knowing the difference between an answer and a promising clue. Consciousness has produced many clues. The brain clearly matters, its organization matters, communication matters, complexity matters, arousal matters, perception, memory, attention, and self-modeling all matter in different ways. But the final connection between physical activity and experience remains missing. And sometimes the most scientifically responsible answer to a difficult question is simply that the explanation has not been found yet. Consciousness is a peculiar thing to investigate, because every attempt to understand it already takes place inside it. Every measurement we examine, every theory we consider, every memory we recall, and every doubt we raise appears within conscious experience. Science studies consciousness from the outside through brains, behavior, chemistry, electrical activity, and patterns of communication. But consciousness is also known from the inside as color, sound, pain, thought, emotion, memory, and the simple feeling of being present. What we do know is that consciousness depends very closely on the physical brain. Brain injury can alter or remove particular forms of experience. Anesthetic drugs can make ordinary awareness disappear and later return. Sleep changes consciousness from moment to moment. Electrical and magnetic stimulation can alter perception. Development gradually changes the capacities that support awareness. And when communication between important neural systems is disrupted, conscious experience can change in remarkable ways. At the same time, the brain can perform surprisingly sophisticated work without awareness. Blindsight shows that visual information can guide behavior even when a person reports seeing nothing. Masking experiments reveal processing without conscious perception. Studies of voluntary action suggest that preparation can begin before conscious intention becomes apparent. Split brain research demonstrates that information available to one cerebral hemisphere may remain inaccessible to the other. So consciousness is not simply another word for information processing. Several theories attempt to explain what distinguishes conscious processing from everything happening quietly beneath it. Global neuronal workspace theory emphasizes widespread broadcasting across the brain. Integrated information theory focuses on intrinsic causal integration. Recurrent processing theory highlights feedback within sensory systems. Higher order theories emphasize representations of mental states themselves. Predictive processing approaches describe perception as an active process of inference. Attention schema theory focuses on the brain's simplified model of its own attention. And bodily accounts emphasize interoception, regulation, and the construction of the self from a living organism. Each approach has captured something important. None has produced an explanation accepted across consciousness science. Even so, practical progress has been substantial. Doctors have better methods for evaluating patients who cannot communicate. Researchers can search for covert awareness after severe brain injury. Anesthesia can be studied with increasingly detailed measurements of brain state. And evidence from other species has expanded serious scientific discussion of animal consciousness far beyond humans and a small collection of familiar mammals. That progress also brings responsibility. When another person cannot speak, certainty about their inner experience may be impossible. The same difficulty applies to animals whose nervous systems and behavior differ greatly from our own. In those situations, scientific uncertainty should encourage care rather than confidence without evidence. The eventual answer may come from better measurements, more precise experiments, stronger comparisons between theories, or concepts that have not yet been invented. Perhaps consciousness will one day appear far less mysterious once the relevant mechanisms are understood, or perhaps understanding it will require changing some of our deepest assumptions about minds, brains, and what an explanation is supposed to accomplish. For now, there is no need to place consciousness outside nature simply because its explanation remains incomplete. It can remain entirely biological and still be profoundly difficult. That is what makes it one of the deepest open questions in neuroscience, biology, psychology, and philosophy. Inside the skull is ordinary living matter, organized into billions of communicating cells. That matter can study distant galaxies, reconstruct the history of the universe, imagine things that have never existed, and ask questions about its own existence. And somehow, while all of that physical activity unfolds, there is also an inward view. There is something it feels like to be here. Science can increasingly describe what happens around that experience. The part it still cannot fully explain is why there is an experience at all,